On the 26th of December 1900, a relief vessel named Hesperus cut through the grey swell of the Atlantic toward a cluster of rocks the locals called the Seven Hunters. The captain, a man named James Harvey, had been making this crossing for years. He knew the rhythm of it, the way the islands rose from the horizon like the knuckles of a drowned fist, the way the lighthouse on Eilean Mòr, the largest of the seven, should have been throwing its beam across the water long before the ship arrived. But there was no light. There had been no light for 11 days, Harvey signalled. No answer. He blew the ship's whistle again and again until the sound of it must have reached every seal and seabird on those godforsaken rocks. Nothing. No figure appeared on the landing platform. No flag was raised. The lighthouse stood white and silent against the winter sky, and the only movement on the island was the wheeling of gulls. A small boat was lowered. Joseph Moore, one of the relief keepers, was the first to step onto the landing stage. He would later describe the sensation as a coldness that had nothing to do with the December wind. The concrete steps leading up to the lighthouse were wet with spray. The ropes on the crane, the mechanism used to haul supplies up the cliff, hung slack and untouched. Moore climbed. Behind him, the sea kept its indifferent rhythm against the rocks. Ahead, the door to the lighthouse stood closed, not locked, just closed. He pushed it open. The clock on the wall had stopped. The fire in the grate had burned down to ash, cold and grey, as though no one had touched it in days. On the kitchen table sat a meal, meat, potatoes, a half-eaten portion, and beside it, a chair lay overturned on the stone floor. Moore called out. His voice echoed in the empty tower and came back to him unanswered. He searched every room, the sleeping quarters, the oil storage, the lamp room at the very top where the great light sat dark and silent, its wicks untrimmed. He found the logbook open on the desk. He found oilskins still hanging on their hooks, 2 sets, as though someone had left in a hurry without dressing for the weather. He found the beds unmade, and he found a feeling he would carry for the rest of his life. 3 men had lived here. Thomas Marshall, the principal keeper, James Ducat, the second assistant, Donald MacArthur, known to everyone as the Occasional, a relief keeper filling in for a regular who had fallen ill. 3 men responsible for a light that guided ships through some of the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. 3 men who had simply vanished, as though the island had swallowed them whole. The table was set for 3. The meal was cold. The chair was on its side. And when Moore finally walked back down those steps to report what he had found, he carried with him a question that has never been answered. What happened on Eilean Mòr in the final days of December 1900? What could make 3 experienced lighthouse keepers abandon their post, leave a meal half-eaten, and disappear into the winter sea without a trace? I have read the theories. I have seen the ghost stories and the supernatural speculation, the television dramatizations and the whispered legends. But tonight, we're not here for the easy version. We're here to sit with the silence itself, to understand who these men were before they became a mystery, to walk the island as it was, rock and wind and the endless grey patience of the Atlantic, and to ask what it means to be forgotten on the edge of the world. This is not a ghost story. It is something stranger. It is a story about 3 men who kept a light burning in the darkness, and about the morning when no one was left to keep it burning anymore. The Flannan Isles sit roughly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. If you have not heard of them, you are not alone. They are not the kind of place that invites visitors. The largest island, Eilean Mòr, rises from the sea like a broken tooth, a sheer cliff of gneiss and basalt, battered by Atlantic storms for longer than human memory. The Vikings called these islands the Seven Hunters, and the name stuck, though what they were hunting has never been clear. Perhaps it was whales. Perhaps it was shelter. Perhaps it was the same thing all sailors seek in waters like these, any fixed point in a world of grey motion. For centuries the islands were considered too remote, too exposed, and too dangerous to be of any use. Fishermen avoided them. The currents around the rocks are treacherous, unpredictable eddies that can spin a boat in circles, tidal surges that appear from nowhere and swamp a vessel before the crew can react. The cliffs offer no natural harbour, no beach, no gentle slope where a boat might be pulled ashore. There is only rock and spray and the constant presence of the sea. But by the late 19th century, the shipping lanes around the Outer Hebrides had grown crowded. Steamers and cargo vessels passed through these waters daily, and the number of wrecks was climbing. The Northern Lighthouse Board, the body responsible for illuminating Scotland's most dangerous coasts, turned its attention to the Flannan Isles. If a lighthouse could be built there, it would fill a crucial gap in the chain of lights that guided vessels through the North Atlantic. The challenge was enormous. The Flannans offered no shelter, no fresh water, no soil deep enough to anchor a foundation. Every ton of stone, every barrel of cement, every pane of glass for the lantern would have to be hauled up a cliff face that rose 75 feet above the sea. Workers would have to live on the island during construction, exposed to some of the worst weather in Britain. More than one engineer declared the project impossible, but the Northern Lighthouse Board was not in the habit of accepting impossible. In 1895, construction began. It took 4 years. 4 years of back-breaking labour on a rock that seemed determined to reject every human presence. The work could only proceed during the brief summer months, and even then, storms would halt progress for weeks at a time. Boats were swamped, equipment was lost, workers fell ill from the cold and the damp and the isolation. The foreman, a man named Arthur Black, later wrote that the Flannans tested every man who set foot on them, tested their nerves, their endurance, and their willingness to keep going when the sea made it clear they were not welcome. By 1899, the lighthouse was complete. It stood 75 feet tall, its white-painted walls visible for miles on a clear day. The light itself was a first-order Fresnel lens, capable of throwing a beam nearly 20 miles across the water. The mechanism was powered by paraffin oil, hauled up the cliff in barrels and stored in a shed near the landing stage. The keepers would trim the wicks, polish the lens, wind the clockwork that turned the light, and log every observation in the official record. It was a job that demanded precision, reliability, and an almost monastic tolerance for solitude. On the 7th of December 1899, the Flannan Isles lighthouse was officially lit for the first time. The beam swept across the Atlantic, a new fixed point in the darkness. Ships adjusted their charts, sailors breathed a little easier, and 3 men settled into the routine of keeping a light alive on one of the most isolated outposts in the British Isles. I want you to understand what that routine was, not the romance of it, not the dramatic image of a lone keeper staring out at the storm, but the actual grinding daily reality of life on Eilean Mòr. The lighthouse was designed to be manned by 3 keepers at all times. The reasoning was simple: isolation is dangerous. A man alone on a rock, cut off from all human contact, will eventually break. 2 men is better, but still risky. Illness, injury, a falling out between companions, and suddenly the light goes dark. 3 men creates a kind of society, however small. 3 men can share the work, keep each other sane, and ensure that at least one of them is always awake to tend the flame. The shifts were brutal. The light had to burn from sunset to sunrise without interruption. One keeper would take the night watch, sitting alone in the lamp room at the top of the tower, trimming the wicks, winding the mechanism, logging the weather every few hours. Another would sleep. The third would handle the domestic work, cooking, cleaning, hauling water from the cistern, maintaining the endless list of small repairs that kept the station functioning. Then the shifts would rotate, day after day, week after week, month after month. The relief vessel came once a fortnight, weather permitting. It brought supplies, coal for the fire, paraffin for the lamp, flour and salt beef and tea and whatever newspapers and letters had accumulated at the shore station. It also brought a replacement keeper, so that each man could take his turn ashore, see his family, remember what it felt like to walk on a street and speak to a stranger. But if the weather turned foul, and in the Outer Hebrides the weather turned foul more often than not, the relief might be delayed by days or even weeks. The keepers simply had to wait. There was no radio, no telephone, no way to call for help. The only communication with the outside world was a flag system and the signal from the light itself. The isolation was absolute in a way that is difficult for a modern mind to comprehend. There were no neighbours, no passing traffic, no casual visitors. The only human beings on Eilean Mòr were the 3 men assigned to keep the light burning, and their entire world consisted of 60 acres of bare rock, a white tower, and the endless grey expanse of the sea. Some men thrived on it. The Northern Lighthouse Board recruited its keepers carefully, looking for men who were steady, self-sufficient, and untroubled by silence. Many came from fishing communities, already accustomed to the rhythms of the sea and the long stretches of quiet between ports. They brought with them books, musical instruments, hobbies that could fill the empty hours. Some wrote poetry, Some carved driftwood into intricate shapes, some simply sat and watched the weather, learning to read the mood of the sky with a precision that no barometer could match. Others did not thrive. The Northern Lighthouse Board's records include more than a few quiet entries about keepers who requested transfer after a single rotation, men who came back from their posting with a haunted look and a reluctance to speak about what they had seen. The isolation could press on a man's mind like a physical weight. The sound of the wind, constant, shifting, never quite the same from one hour to the next, could begin to feel like a voice. The sea, visible from every window, became less a landscape than a presence, something vast and patient and indifferent to human existence. And then there were the storms. The Flannan Isles sit directly in the path of Atlantic depressions, the great swirling systems of low pressure that roll in from the west and batter the coast of Scotland with wind and rain and towering waves. The storms that strike the Outer Hebrides are not like storms elsewhere. They are not events that pass. They are presences that settle over the islands for days at a time, blotting out the sun, filling the air with salt spray, shaking the very rock beneath the lighthouse. The keepers recorded wind gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour. They described waves that climbed the cliffs and crashed against the walls of the tower, 80 feet above the normal waterline. They wrote about the noise. A roar so constant and so overwhelming that it became a kind of silence, a wall of sound that swallowed all other sensation. In conditions like these, there was nothing to do but wait. The keepers would secure the lamp, seal the doors, and sit in the relative safety of the living quarters, while the island shook around them. Sleep was nearly impossible. Conversation was difficult. The world contracted to the space of a few rooms and the knowledge that, beyond the walls, nature was doing its best to tear the whole structure down. And yet, the light had to keep burning. That was the duty. That was the sacred obligation of every lighthouse keeper in the world. No matter the storm, no matter the danger, the light must not go dark. Ships were out there, somewhere in the grey chaos. Sailors were depending on that beam to guide them past the rocks. A dark light was a death sentence for anyone who trusted it. So the keepers climbed the tower, they trimmed the wicks, they wound the mechanism, they stood alone in the lamp room surrounded by glass, watching the storm tear the world apart outside, and they kept the light burning, night after night, storm after storm, until the relief vessel arrived and they could finally rest. This was the life that Thomas Marshall, James Ducat and Donald MacArthur had chosen. This was the world they inhabited in December of 1900, when the weather turned violent and something happened that no one has ever been able to explain. Let me tell you about the men themselves. Thomas Marshall was the principal keeper of Eilean Mòr, the senior man, responsible for the smooth operation of the station and the welfare of his crew. He was 43 years old in December 1900, a veteran of the Northern Lighthouse Board with nearly 2 decades of service. He had worked some of the most isolated stations in Scotland, and he had earned a reputation as a calm, competent and deeply experienced keeper. The board trusted him. His colleagues respected him. In the small world of Scottish lighthouse keepers, Thomas Marshall was exactly the kind of man you wanted running a station like the Flannans. He was also a meticulous record keeper. The logbook entries in his hand are precise and detailed, noting the weather, the state of the sea, the condition of the lamp, and any unusual occurrences. Reading them now, more than a century later, you can sense the methodical mind behind the words, a man who understood that his observations might one day be read by others, and who took care to make them clear and accurate. James Ducat was the second assistant, a position that made him third in the hierarchy, but no less essential to the operation of the light. He was 43 as well, the same age as Marshall, and he had served with the board for nearly as long. His background was in the merchant marine. He had spent years at sea before turning to lighthouse work, and he brought with him a sailor's instincts for weather and wave. He was known as a quiet man, steady and reliable, the kind of keeper who could be trusted to hold the night watch without complaint and to keep his head when the storms came. Donald MacArthur was the occasional, a term the board used for relief keepers, the men who filled in when a regular keeper fell ill or took leave. He was the youngest of the 3 in his early 40s, and he had less experience with isolated stations than his colleagues. But he was familiar with the work, and he had volunteered for the Flannans posting when the regular assistant took sick leave in early December. It was supposed to be a temporary assignment. A few weeks on the rock, then back to the relative comfort of the shore station. He left behind a wife and children on Lewis. He told them he would see them at Christmas. These were not dramatic men. They were not adventurers or seekers of glory. They were working-class Scotsmen doing a difficult job in a remote place because the job needed doing and they were capable of doing it. They kept the light burning. They logged the weather. They waited for the relief vessel and dreamed of home. In any other December, their names would have appeared on a few official documents and then faded into the anonymity of history. But December 1900 was not any other December. The trouble began, as far as anyone can reconstruct, around the middle of the month. The last confirmed sighting of the Flannan Light came on the 15th of December. A passing steamer, the Arcta, noted in its log that the light was functioning normally as the ship passed through the area. The captain saw nothing unusual. The beam swept across the water in its regular rhythm, and the steamer continued on its way. But later that same night, another vessel, a different ship, on a different course, passed within sight of the Flannans and saw nothing. No light, no beam, just darkness where a light should have been. The captain noted the absence in his log, but he did not raise an alarm. There were 100 reasons why a light might appear to be out. Fog, rain, a trick of the angle, his own fatigue. The weather was foul that week, with gales sweeping in from the west, and visibility was poor. Perhaps he had simply missed it. Perhaps the light had been obscured by spray. He made his entry and moved on. Word reached the Northern Lighthouse Board on the 18th of December, when the Archtor arrived in port and its captain mentioned that other ships had reported the Flannan Light dark. The board was concerned but not yet alarmed. Storms had been battering the Outer Hebrides for days, and it was possible that the light had been temporarily disabled by damage. The relief vessel, Hesperus, was scheduled to make its regular run to the Flannans on the 20th. The board decided to wait, but the 20th came and the weather did not cooperate. The gales continued. The seas were too rough for a crossing. The Hesperus waited in port, its crew watching the sky for a break in the clouds. December 21st, still too rough. December 22nd, the same. December 23rd. Christmas Eve approached, and the crew of the Hesperus grew restless. Many of them had families waiting on Lewis. They wanted to make the run, deliver the relief keeper, and return in time for the holiday. But Captain Harvey would not risk his ship or his men in seas like these. They waited. On Christmas Day, the weather finally began to ease. The wind dropped, the swells subsided, and on the morning of December 26th, Boxing Day as the British call it, the Hesperus finally set out for the Flannan Isles. Joseph Moore stood on the deck as the islands rose from the horizon. He was the relief keeper, the man who would be staying on Eilean Mòr while one of the regular keepers returned to the mainland for his leave. He had made this crossing before, he knew the routine, but something felt wrong even before they reached the landing stage. There was no flag flying from the station, no signal to indicate that the keepers had seen the approaching vessel. No figure appeared on the cliff to operate the crane that would haul the supplies up the rock face. Captain Harvey blew the whistle. The sound echoed off the cliffs and came back empty. Moore went ashore alone. The mate, a man named McCormack, stayed with the boat, watching as Moore climbed the concrete steps toward the lighthouse. Later, McCormack would describe the scene with a single word: wrong. Everything about the island felt wrong. The silence, the stillness, the absence of human movement where human movement should have been. Moore pushed open the door. The kitchen was cold. The fire had been dead for days, perhaps longer. The clock on the wall had stopped at some unknown hour. On the table sat a meal, meat and potatoes partially eaten, and one of the 3 chairs lay on its side as though someone had risen in a hurry and knocked it over. Moore called out. His voice rang in the stone tower and returned unanswered. He searched the ground floor. Empty. He climbed to the sleeping quarters. The beds were unmade, the blankets rumpled. 2 sets of oilskins hung on their hooks near the door, the heavy waterproof coats that the keepers wore when venturing out in bad weather. But one set was missing, and all 3 men were gone. Moore climbed higher, to the lamp room at the top of the tower. The light was dark. The mechanism had not been wound. The oil reservoirs were low. Everything was exactly as it should have been if the keepers had simply stepped away for a moment. Except that the keepers had not stepped away for a moment. The keepers had vanished. He found the logbook on the desk in the principal keeper's quarters. Thomas Marshall's handwriting was familiar, neat and precise as always. The entries for the first half of December were unremarkable. Weather observations, routine maintenance, the ordinary rhythm of life on the rock. But the entries for the 12th, 13th and 14th of December were different. December 12th. Severe winds the like of which I have never seen before in 20 years. Marshall noted that James Ducat had been very quiet. Donald MacArthur had been crying. December the 13th. Storm still raging, unable to go out. Ducat quiet, MacArthur crying. December 14th. Noon, grey daylight. Me, Ducat and the occasional prayed. The entry for the 15th of December, the last entry in the log, read simply, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." Mòr stared at the words. Outside, the sea was not calm. The sea had not been calm for days, and the Flannan Isles did not experience storms in December that made grown men cry and pray. The weather records from the nearby Isle of Lewis showed nothing unusual for that period. Rough, certainly, but nothing beyond the ordinary violence of a Scottish winter. What storm was Thomas Marshall describing? What had he seen that made him invoke God in an official logbook? And why, if the storm had ended and the sea was calm, had all three men vanished from the island? Mòr descended the tower. He walked the grounds. He searched the outbuildings, the oil store, the provision shed, the small chapel that the keepers had built from loose stones. He found nothing. No bodies. No notes. No signs of struggle. Just the empty island, the cold lighthouse, and the overturned chair in the kitchen. At the western landing stage, the one facing the open Atlantic, he found damage. The iron railings that lined the steps had been twisted and torn. Heavy equipment, ropes, crates, a lifebuoy, had been ripped from their moorings and scattered across the rocks. The concrete itself was cracked in places, as though something enormous had struck it with tremendous force. Mòr looked out at the sea. The water was grey and restless, the eternal Atlantic swell rolling in from the west. Somewhere out there beyond the horizon, ships were sailing and families were gathering, and the world was going on without the slightest awareness of what had happened on this rock. 3 men had walked down these steps and into the ocean, and the ocean had taken them, and that was all. He returned to the boat and told Captain Harvey what he had found. The news reached the Northern Lighthouse Board within days. An investigation was launched immediately. Robert Muirhead, the superintendent responsible for the Flannan station, travelled to Eilean Mòr himself to examine the scene. He interviewed Joseph Mòr. He read the logbook entries. He walked the damaged western landing and studied the twisted railings, and in his official report he offered the only conclusion that seemed to fit the evidence. "From evidence which I was able to procure," Muirhead wrote, "I'm of opinion that the 3 men, having gone down to the proximity of the west landing to secure the box with the mooring ropes, etc., and the crane, or with such ropes and other gear as might require to be moved to a safer position, were caught by an unforeseen wave and swept out to sea. An unforeseen wave, a surge that came without warning, climbing the cliff with enough force to tear iron from stone and drag 3 grown men into the depths." It was a plausible explanation. The west landing was known to be dangerous in heavy weather, and freak waves, rogue swells that appear without warning and tower above their neighbours, were not unknown in these waters, but the explanation raised as many questions as it answered. Why had all 3 men gone to the landing together? The standing orders were clear. At least 1 keeper must remain in the lighthouse at all times to tend the lamp and maintain the watch. Thomas Marshall, with his 2 decades of experience, would have known this rule as well as anyone. What emergency could have drawn all 3 men out of the tower simultaneously, in the middle of a storm? And why were only 2 sets of oilskins missing? If the men had gone out to secure equipment in bad weather, they would all have been wearing their waterproof coats. But 1 set remained on its hook by the door, as though one of the men had rushed out without dressing for the storm. And what of the logbook entries? Marshall's description of the storm, the like of which I have never seen before in 20 years, did not match any weather recorded on Lewis or on any passing ship. Ducat, a veteran sailor, reduced to silence. MacArthur, a grown man, crying. 3 experienced keepers praying in their quarters while the sea raged outside. This was not the language of an ordinary December gale. This was the language of men who believed they were about to die. Yet the final entry said the storm had ended. The sea was calm. God was over all. And then they were gone. The bodies were never found. The Northern Lighthouse Board conducted a thorough search of the waters around the Flannans, but the Atlantic does not return what it takes. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur were declared dead by misadventure, their names added to the long list of men lost to the sea in the service of the lights. A replacement crew was sent to Eilean Mòr. The lamp was lit again. The logbook was continued. Life on the rock resumed its ordinary rhythm, as though nothing had happened, as though 3 men had not simply ceased to exist between one entry and the next. But the questions lingered. They lingered in the official reports, which acknowledged that no certain conclusion could be reached. They lingered in the memories of the keepers who followed, some of whom claimed to hear strange sounds in the night or to feel presences in the empty rooms. They lingered in the folk memory of the Outer Hebrides, where the story of the Flannan keepers became a legend, told and retold in pubs and fishing boats and around winter fires. What really happened on Eilean Mòr? What storm had Thomas Marshall seen that left no trace in any weather record? What had driven 3 disciplined men to abandon their post and their duty and rush into the killing sea? I do not have the answers. After more than a century, no one does. But I think the questions themselves matter. I think there is something worth holding in the mystery, something about the limits of what we can know and the silence that waits at the edge of the world. Tonight, we are not going to solve the disappearance of the Flannan keepers. We are going to sit with it. We are going to walk the island as they walked it, feel the wind as they felt it, and listen to the sound of the sea against the rocks. We are going to read the logbook entries again, slowly, and ask what kind of fear could produce those words. We are going to meet the men who came before and the men who came after, and we are going to try to understand what it meant to keep a light burning on a rock at the end of the earth. This is a story about 3 men who vanished, but it is also a story about the place that swallowed them, the grey Flannan Isles, the 7 hunters, rising from the Atlantic like monuments to everything the sea has ever taken and refused to give back. The light is still there. It still turns, automated now, no keeper required. The beam still sweeps across the water, where Thomas Marshall and James Ducat and Donald MacArthur disappeared into the swell. And if you stand on the cliff above the western landing on a winter night, when the wind is high and the spray is climbing the rocks, you might begin to understand why some lights never go out, even when their keepers do. The Flannan Isles did not always have a light. For most of human history, the 7 hunters were simply there. 7 low, treeless humps of rock breaking the surface of the Atlantic 21 miles west of Lewis, visible on clear days as a dark smear on the horizon, invisible on most days, wrapped in the grey curtain of rain and mist that hangs over the Outer Hebrides for much of the year. The Vikings knew them. They called them the Flannans, though the exact meaning of the name has been lost. The monks of the Celtic Church knew them too. On Eilean Mòr, the largest of the 7, there are ruins. The remains of a small chapel dedicated to St. Flannan, a 7th century Irish bishop who may or may not have visited these rocks, and beside it the stone walls of a handful of cells where hermits once lived, praying and fasting on the edge of the known world. Try to imagine that. A man, or a small group of men, rowing a wooden currach through the swells of the North Atlantic, landing on the bare rocks of Eilean Mòr, hauling up provisions, and then staying. Not for a week, not for a season, for years perhaps, living on seabirds and fish and whatever grain they could bring with them, praying in a stone cell no larger than a closet, watching the storms roll in from the west, knowing that rescue might never come, that the next gale might be the last. What drives a person to that? What kind of faith, or what kind of madness, or what kind of longing for silence that the mainland could not provide? The hermits are gone now. Their chapel is a ruin, its roof open to the sky, its altar long since crumbled. But the impulse that brought them there, the pull of the remote, the sacred weight of isolation, that never left the Flannans, it simply changed form. The monks sought God on the edge of the world. The keepers who came after them sought something else. The steady rhythm of duty, the quiet pride of a job done well, the slow accumulation of days spent keeping a light burning for ships that would never know their names. The decision to build a lighthouse on the Flannan Isles was not made lightly. The Northern Lighthouse Board knew better than anyone the cost of such projects, measured in pounds and shillings, yes, but also in lives, in years of brutal labour, in the steady toll that isolated duty takes on the minds of the men who serve. The commissioners had heard the proposals for a Flannan light for decades. Shipmasters petitioned for it. Insurance underwriters lobbied for it. The strait between the Outer Hebrides and the open Atlantic was one of the busiest sea lanes in the world, and it was also one of the most dangerous, a place where currents collided, where fog rolled in without warning, where the winter gales could build waves tall enough to break over the deck of a full-rigged ship. The 7 hunters, unmarked and unlit, were a hazard to every vessel that passed. But building on the Flannans was another matter. The islands were exposed to the full force of the Atlantic. There was no natural harbour, no sheltered cove where men and supplies could be landed safely. The cliffs rose sheer from the water on all sides, offering only a handful of narrow gullies where a small boat might, on a calm day, find purchase. In bad weather, and bad weather was the rule, not the exception, no landing was possible at all. A lighthouse on Eilean Mòr would be one of the most isolated in the British Isles, cut off from the mainland for weeks or months at a time, entirely dependent on supply ships that might not be able to reach it. The board hesitated. Other projects took precedence. Years passed. Storms continued to claim ships in the waters around Lewis, and finally in 1895 the decision was made. A lighthouse would be built on the highest point of Eilean Mòr, 200 feet above the sea. It would be staffed by 3 keepers at all times, rotating on a schedule that allowed each man a fortnight ashore before returning to the rock. It would have 2 landings, one on the western side of the island, one on the eastern, so that boats could approach in almost any wind direction. And it would be built to last, designed by David Allen Stevenson of the famous lighthouse building dynasty, engineered to withstand whatever the Atlantic could throw at it. The construction took 4 years. Think about that number. 4 years of ferrying materials across 21 miles of open ocean. 4 years of landing on those narrow wave-washed gullies, hauling cut stone and iron and glass up the steep paths to the summit. 4 years of winter storms that shut down all work for weeks at a time, of men living in temporary quarters on a treeless rock, of accidents and injuries and setbacks. The workmen who built the Flannan Lighthouse earned their wages. Many of them were Lewismen, men who knew the sea and understood the risks, but the Flannans tested even them. One foreman, a man named Morrison, kept a journal during the construction that survives in fragments. He described days when the wind was so fierce that men could not stand upright on the exposed cliff tops. He described waves breaking over the western landing with such force that the spray reached the foundations of the tower, 200 feet above. He described the sound the wind made in the stones at night, a low continuous moan that some of the men swore was the voice of the old monks still praying in their ruined cells. On the 7th of December, 1899, the lamp was lit for the first time. A first-order Fresnel lens, imported from France, began its slow rotation in the lantern room, sending a beam of white light across the sea every 30 seconds. Ships rounding the butt of Lewis could now see the Flannan light from 24 nautical miles away. A steady pulse in the darkness, a promise that someone was watching, someone was keeping the way safe. The Northern Lighthouse Board sent its congratulations. The newspapers in Edinburgh and Glasgow printed small notices, and Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, or men very like them, for the earliest keeper rosters are incomplete, climbed the spiral stairs to begin their vigil. The life of a lighthouse keeper is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. We think of loneliness, and loneliness was certainly part of it. The long hours with no company but the other keepers, the isolation from family and friends, the sense of being suspended in time, waiting for the relief boat that might or might not come. But loneliness was only one strand in a larger weave. There was also the physical labour, which was constant and exhausting. The lamp had to be wound every few hours, its clockwork mechanism cranked by hand. The lens had to be polished, its thousands of glass prisms kept free of salt and dust. The oil had to be hauled up the stairs, gallons of it, heavy and slippery. The buildings had to be maintained, whitewashed, repaired, kept tight against the weather. The rain gauges and barometers had to be read, the logbooks filled in, the signal flags raised and lowered. A lighthouse was not a passive thing. It required constant, devoted attention, and if a keeper neglected his duties, men died. Not in the abstract, not someday. Ships ran aground, hulls broke open, sailors drowned in the cold water. The light was life, and keeping it burning was a sacred trust. And then there was the weather, the endless, relentless weather. On the Flannans, wind was the constant companion, the bass note beneath every other sound. Even on calm days you could hear it, a low whisper around the tower, a rustle in the grass. On storm days it screamed. It hammered the walls with a force that made the stones tremble. It drove the spray so high that salt crusted the windows of the lantern room 200 feet above the sea. It made going outside a battle, a lean-into-the-teeth-of-it ordeal that left men exhausted and soaked. The keepers of the Flannan Lighthouse became experts in wind. They could tell by the sound whether it was blowing force 6 or force 8, whether it was backing or veering, whether the storm was building or breaking. They could feel it in their bones before the barometer began to drop. Rain came often, and fog came more often still. The Flannans sit in one of the foggiest regions of the North Atlantic, where the warm water of the Gulf Stream meets the cold currents flowing down from Iceland. On foggy days, the light was useless. The beam swallowed by the murk before it could reach any passing ship, and the keepers switched to the foghorn, a great steam-powered bellower that sent its low moan across the water at regular intervals. The sound carried for miles. It also carried through the walls of the keepers' quarters, through the floors, through the very stones of the tower. Men who served on fog-prone lights often suffered a particular kind of madness, a slow unravelling brought on by days or weeks of that unceasing moan. They called it fog fever. They called it the horn sickness. They called it sometimes going west, a euphemism for the mental break that came when the sound finally became too much. The keepers of the Flannan Lighthouse were chosen carefully. The Northern Lighthouse Board knew that not every man could handle the isolation, the confinement, the peculiar pressures of life on a rock. They looked for steadiness, for discipline, for men who could follow a routine without chafing against it, who could live in close quarters with the same two companions for weeks at a time without coming to blows. They looked for men who were, in the language of the time, of good moral character, which meant in practice men who did not drink to excess, who did not quarrel, who attended church and kept their contracts. The Flannans were not a posting for new recruits. They were a posting for experienced keepers, men who had proved themselves on other lights and earned the board's trust. James Ducat was such a man. He had served the Northern Lighthouse Board for more than 20 years by the time he was posted to Eilean Mòr as principal keeper. He was 43 years old in December 1900, a veteran, a professional, a man who had seen every kind of weather the Scottish coast could offer and had never once failed in his duty. The records describe him as quiet, competent, steady under pressure. His superiors trusted him, his subordinates respected him. He was the kind of man you would want beside you in a crisis, the kind of man who would not panic, who would think clearly, who would find a way. He had a wife and children on the mainland waiting for his fortnight's leave. He had every reason to come home. Thomas Marshall was younger, 28 years old, with only a few years of service on the lights, but already marked for advancement. He was the second assistant keeper on Eilean Mòr, the lowest ranked of the three, but his logbook entries, the ones that would later be read and reread by investigators and historians and amateur sleuths, show a man of intelligence and sensitivity, a man who could observe the world around him with precision and describe what he saw in clear, evocative prose. His final entries are the reason we know anything at all about the days before the disappearance. They're also the reason the mystery has never been solved. Marshall saw something in those last days, something that frightened him deeply, something that reduced his experienced colleagues to tears and prayer. He wrote it down, and then he too was gone. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, brought in to replace a man named William Ross who had fallen ill. He was the wild card, the unknown quantity, a man from the Isle of Lewis, 40 years old, experienced with the sea but less experienced with the particular demands of lighthouse service. The board's records say little about him. He was married, he was considered reliable, he was available when Ross took sick, and he agreed to take the posting on short notice. That is all we know. Whether he was steady or nervous, brave or fearful, devout or sceptical, the records do not say. He walked on to Eilean Mòr in early December 1900, and 3 weeks later he walked off the edge of history. These were the men who kept the Flannan light in the last weeks of the 19th century's final year. 3 ordinary men doing an extraordinary job in a place designed to test the limits of human endurance. They were not adventurers, they were not daredevils, they were workers, tradesmen, men with families and debts, and small pleasures and large responsibilities. They did not choose the Flannans for glory. They chose them because the pay was decent and the work was honest, and someone had to keep the light burning. Picture them on a December evening gathered in the small kitchen of the keeper's quarters. The lamp is lit, the lens is turning, the beam is sweeping out across the water. Outside, the wind is rising. Not yet a gale, but you can feel it building, feel the pressure dropping in your ears. Ducat is reviewing the stores, making a note in the supply ledger. Marshall is at the table writing in the logbook, recording the weather, the wind direction, the state of the sea. MacArthur is by the stove, nursing a cup of tea, watching the flames. No one is speaking. There is nothing to say. The routine is the routine. The light is the light. The storm will come or it will not come. Either way, they will be here, doing their duty, keeping the faith. What were they thinking in those quiet hours before the end? Did Ducat think of his wife, of his children, of the Christmas he hoped to spend with them on the mainland? Did Marshall think of the career ahead of him, the promotions he expected, the better postings that would come with time and experience? Did MacArthur think of the wife waiting for him on Lewis, of the fishing boats and familiar harbours, and the life that was so much easier than this? We cannot know. We can only guess. We can only project our own hopes and fears onto these men who left so little of themselves behind. What we do know is what Marshall wrote in the logbook. Those entries, spare, precise, increasingly alarming, are the closest thing we have to a window into the final days. And what they show is something that does not fit the official explanation, does not fit the weather records, does not fit anything that makes sense. Severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. Ducat, a man of 20 years' experience, reduced to silence. MacArthur, a grown man from Lewis, who had spent his whole life on the edge of the Atlantic crying by the fireside. All three men praying together, kneeling in their quarters, as though they believed they might not survive the night. What storm? What could possibly have shaken these men so deeply? The meteorological records from Lewis, just 21 miles away, show nothing unusual. The passing ships logged no extraordinary weather. The barometric readings from the stations on the Hebrides show the ordinary fluctuations of an ordinary December. If a storm of unprecedented violence had struck the Flannans, someone else would have noticed. Someone else would have recorded it, but no one did. There are theories, of course. There are always theories. Some involve freak waves, rogue walls of water that can rise out of a relatively calm sea, triggered by the collision of currents, or the focusing of swell energy by undersea topography. The Flannans sit at the edge of the continental shelf, where the ocean floor drops away sharply, and such waves are not unknown in these waters. A single massive wave striking without warning could have swept all three keepers into the sea before they had a chance to react. It would explain the suddenness of the disappearance, the lack of struggle, the absence of bodies. Others have suggested that the storm Marshall described was real, but intensely localized. A microburst or a waterspout perhaps, a violent phenomenon that could have struck Eilean Mòr while leaving the rest of the region untouched. Such things happen. Weather is not uniform. A storm can rage over 1 square mile of ocean while the sun shines a few miles away. But a storm that left no trace in any weather record, that was seen by no ship, that affected no other island in the Flannans, that would be remarkable. That would be almost unprecedented. Still others have pointed to the cliffs themselves. The western landing on Eilean Mòr is a treacherous place, a narrow gully where the Atlantic swells funnel between sheer rock walls. Even on relatively calm days, the water there can surge unpredictably, rising and falling with a rhythm that can catch even experienced boatmen off guard. A keeper standing on the landing platform, securing a rope or checking a crane, could be swept away in an instant by a wave he never saw coming. And if one keeper went into the water, the others might have tried to save him, might have rushed down from the tower, might have gone to the rescue, might have been caught by the next wave, and the next. This was, in fact, the conclusion reached by Robert Muirhead, the superintendent who investigated the disappearance. In his official report to the Northern Lighthouse Board, he wrote that he believed all three keepers had gone to the western landing to secure the equipment there against a storm, that one had been swept away by a sudden sea, that the others had tried to save him, and that all three had perished. It was a plausible explanation. It was a reasonable explanation. It was the explanation that the board accepted and the explanation that went into the historical record. But it left questions unanswered. It did not explain the logbook entries, the fear, the tears, the prayers. It did not explain why the men would have gone to the landing without their oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats that every keeper wore when venturing out in bad weather. It did not explain why only one set of oilskins was missing from the lighthouse, as though only one man had dressed for the storm. It did not explain the half-eaten meal, the overturned chair, the clock that had stopped. It did not explain most of all the silence, the 12 days when the light did not shine and no one knew why. The Flannans kept their secret, the sea kept its dead, and the story, unresolved, passed into legend. In the years that followed, the lighthouse continued to operate. New keepers came, served their rotations, and left. Some of them reported nothing unusual. Others reported sounds they could not explain. Footsteps in the empty rooms, voices on the wind, the sense of being watched by something they could not see. A few refused to return after their first posting, claiming that the island had an atmosphere they could not tolerate, a weight in the air that pressed on the chest and made sleep impossible. The board noted these complaints but took no action. Imagination, they said. The loneliness getting to them. The inevitable strain of isolated service. But the stories accumulated. They filtered back to Lewis, to the mainland, to the wider world. By the mid-20th century, the Flannan Isles had acquired a reputation, a whispered notoriety that attached itself to the place like barnacles to a hull. Ghost hunters visited, though the board discouraged such expeditions. Journalists came looking for a story. Poets and songwriters found inspiration in the mystery, composing ballads about the vanished keepers that were sung in folk clubs from Edinburgh to Dublin. The Flannans became a byword for the unexplained, a shorthand for everything the rational mind cannot quite grasp. And still the light turned, night after night, year after year, decade after decade. The keepers changed, the technology changed, the oil lamps gave way to electricity, the clockwork mechanisms to automated motors, the human watchmen to sensors and alarms. In 1971, the last keepers left Eilean Mòr, and the Flannan Lighthouse became fully automated, a machine tending itself on a rock at the end of the world, no longer requiring the men who had given their lives to its service. The automation was efficient, it was economical. It was also, in a way that no one at the board would have put into words, a kind of surrender. The lights had finally won. They had outlasted the keepers, outlasted the old ways, outlasted the whole tradition of human beings standing watch against the dark. The beams still swept, the horns still sounded, but no one was home. I visited the Flannans once, on a research expedition that took me to several of the remote Scottish lights. The crossing from Lewis was rough, it usually is, and by the time we rounded Eilean Mòr and made for the eastern landing, I was soaked and seasick and beginning to question every decision that had led me to that moment. The island rises sheer from the water, grey cliffs topped with grey grass, the tower white against the grey sky. There is no colour on the Flannans, there is only the grey and the white and the endless restless sea. We landed in the old gully, where the keepers had landed for 70 years, and climbed the steep steps cut into the rock. The path to the lighthouse is narrow and exposed, with nothing but a chain railing between you and the drop. The wind was blowing maybe force 5 that day. Not a gale, nothing remarkable, but I found myself clinging to the chain, my knuckles white, my breath short. The sound of the waves below was constant, a steady roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I understood, in that moment, why the logbook entries were so concerned with weather. On Eilean Mòr, weather is not background. It is the entire foreground. It is everything. The lighthouse itself was smaller than I expected. Photographs make it seem monumental, a pillar of defiance against the Atlantic, but standing beside it I realised it was modest, functional rather than grand, built for purpose rather than beauty. The walls were thick, yes, 2 feet of dressed stone designed to withstand whatever the ocean could throw. But the windows were narrow, the doorways were low, the rooms inside were cramped and Spartan, sized for efficiency rather than comfort. 3 men lived here, I reminded myself, for weeks at a time, in winter, sometimes longer when the relief ship could not make the crossing. 3 men in these small rooms with nowhere to go, no one to see, nothing to do but tend the light and wait for the weather to break. I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, holding the iron handrail that generations of keepers had polished smooth with their palms. 71 steps. I counted them, the way the keepers must have counted them, 2 or 3 times a night during their watches. The stairs were worn in the centre, shallow grooves where countless boots had passed. Thomas Marshall climbed these stairs. James Duckett climbed them. Donald MacArthur climbed them, on his first posting probably still learning the rhythm of the place. the particular creak of the fourth step from the top, the way the wind moaned through the ventilators. All three of them climbed these stairs on the night of December 14th, 1900. None of them ever climbed down. The lantern room was stripped now, the original lens long since removed to a museum. But the view remained. I stood where the light had stood and looked out at the Atlantic, at Island Tea to the northwest, at the distant smudge of Lewis to the east, at the vast grey nothing of the open ocean to the south and west. The horizon was unbroken. There was nothing out there. Nothing but water and sky and the occasional gannet plunging for fish, and yet I felt watched. I cannot explain it better than that. I felt the way you feel in an empty house where something bad has happened, that prickling awareness at the back of the neck, that sense of presence in the absence. The other members of my party reported similar feelings. One of them, a Lighthouse historian who had visited dozens of remote stations, told me afterward that the Flannans were the only place where he had felt genuinely unsettled. "There's something wrong with that rock," he said. "I don't believe in ghosts, and I don't believe in curses, but there is something wrong with that rock." We stayed 3 hours documenting what remained, taking photographs, recording measurements for the archive. I walked every inch of the station, the lighthouse itself, the ruined compound where the keeper's quarters had stood, the oil store, the coal store, the walls of the eastern courtyard where the crane once swung supplies up from the landing. I found the brass plate above the door that gave the light specifications. Established 1899, height above sea level 330 feet, visible for 24 miles in clear weather. I found the remains of the vegetable garden that the keepers had tried to maintain, now overgrown with salt-resistant scrub. I found the privy, built into the rock at the edge of the cliff, exposed to every wind that blew. I tried to imagine using that privy in a December gale, the rain driving horizontal, the sea thundering against the rocks below. The courage it must have required simply to function in this place, the grinding daily effort of survival. And I went to the West Landing. I had to. You cannot visit the Flannans and research the disappearance without going to the West Landing, even though there is nothing there to see. Nothing but steps cut into the rock, a rusted winch, a concrete platform where the crane once stood, and the sea, the endless sea, hurling itself against the cliffs as it has done for millennia, and will do for millennia more. I stood on the upper platform where the supply box had been lashed, and looked down at the water. The swell was maybe 8 feet that day, moderate by Flannan standards, barely worth mentioning in the logbook. The waves broke against the rocks with a sound like distant artillery, throwing spray 30 feet into the air. Every 7th or 8th wave was larger than the others, and when these hit, the whole platform trembled slightly beneath my feet. I understood, watching the water, how easy it would be to misjudge, to think you had time when you did not, to turn your back at the wrong moment, to reach for a rope or a box or a fallen piece of equipment and find yourself suddenly off balance, suddenly falling, suddenly in the grip of something that did not let go. But 3 men, all 3, at once, and the body of Donald MacArthur in the kitchen doorway, half a meal on the table, the oilskins still on their hooks. The West Landing could explain 2 deaths. It could explain a terrible accident, a rescue attempt gone wrong, 2 keepers in the water before anyone knew what was happening. But it could not explain the 3rd keeper sitting down to dinner and then walking out into a storm without his coat. The official theory has always been that MacArthur ran out when he heard his colleagues in distress, that he acted on instinct without thinking, and paid for his courage with his life. This is possible. Men do irrational things in emergencies. The urge to help, to save, to intervene. It overwhelms caution, overwhelms self-preservation, overwhelms everything. If MacArthur had been in the kitchen and heard a cry from the West Landing, he might have bolted without stopping for his oilskins, without stopping for anything, driven by the same impulse that makes a parent run toward danger when their child screams. But the logbook. Always we return to the logbook. The entries about the storm, the entries that describe weather that did not exist, or that existed in some way the official record does not capture. What did Thomas Marshall see? What did he hear? What did he feel, sitting in that small room with the wind howling outside and the light turning above, that compelled him to write those strange, frightened words? I have spent years now collecting theories about the Flannan Isles disappearance, serious theories from maritime historians and meteorologists, crackpot theories from paranormal enthusiasts and conspiracy obsessives, literary theories, from scholars who have traced the way the story has been told and retold until it becomes almost impossible to separate fact from embellishment. I have a filing cabinet full of documents, newspaper clippings, academic papers, correspondence from descendants of the men involved, transcripts of radio interviews with keepers who served on the Flannans in later decades, and after all of it, after years of research and a visit to the island itself, I can tell you with confidence that I do not know what happened. No one knows. No one will ever know. What I can tell you is what the evidence suggests and what the evidence cannot support. The evidence suggests that the men died sometime between the evening of December 15th, 1900 and the arrival of the Hesperus on December 26th. The last log entry is dated December 15th. The light was seen functioning on December 7th by the steamer Archtor, but was reported dark by the same vessel on December 15th. This gives us a window of roughly a week, during which the disappearance occurred, with the most likely date being the 15th itself, the day of Marshall's final log entry, the day the light went out. The evidence suggests that the men left the lighthouse in haste, at least 2 of them fully dressed for outdoor work, one of them in his shirt sleeves. This implies an emergency, something that called them out urgently, something that did not permit the ordinary precautions of suiting up for a gale. The west landing shows signs of damage, though we cannot know for certain whether this damage was inflicted on December 15th or accumulated over years of Atlantic storms. A box of supplies was missing from the platform. Ropes were tangled. The winch was not properly secured. The evidence suggests that the men were aware of something troubling in the days before their disappearance. Marshall's logbook entries describe weather conditions that seem impossible. Storms of unprecedented fury, a 12-second keeper very quiet, fears and prayers that have no business appearing in an official record. Either Marshall was hallucinating, or he was lying, or he was experiencing something that the official meteorological record does not capture. None of these possibilities is satisfying. All of them are unsettling. The evidence suggests that the men were taken by the sea. This is the simplest explanation, the one that requires the fewest assumptions, the one that aligns with everything we know about the danger of working at isolated lighthouses in the North Atlantic. Waves kill. Unexpected waves kill without warning. 3 men, overcome by a single catastrophic surge. It happens. It has happened before and since at lighthouse stations around the world. The sea takes what it takes, and it does not return what it has taken. But the evidence cannot explain the state of the kitchen, the half-eaten meal, the overturned chair, the sense that MacArthur was interrupted, not called away, but interrupted suddenly without warning, in a manner that prevented him from even standing upright. The official theory asks us to believe that he heard a cry and ran, but men who hear a cry and run do not knock over their chairs. They push back from the table, they stand, they move toward the door with purpose. An overturned chair suggests violence of some kind, a shock, a fright, something that made MacArthur leap up and stumble backward, away from whatever he had seen or heard. And the evidence cannot explain the oilskins. MacArthur's oilskins were still on their hook by the door. In the ordinary sequence of events, a cry from outside, a keeper rushing to help, the oilskins would be the first thing grabbed. They were right there, inches from the doorway, designed precisely for this purpose, to be seized in an instant and thrown on as you ran out into the weather. A man who hears his colleagues drowning and runs to save them might forget to buckle his coat. He would not forget to grab it entirely, not when it was hanging right beside him, not when the wind outside was screaming and the rain was driving horizontal, unless he was not running toward the west landing, unless he was running from something else entirely. I do not propose an alternative theory. I have none to propose. I am only telling you what the evidence says and what it fails to say, what it explains and what it leaves hanging in the cold Atlantic wind like the ghost of a question that will never be answered. The supernatural explanations are tempting. They have been tempting for over a century. Ghost ships, sea serpents, vengeful spirits of drowned sailors, fairies. This one especially, because the Outer Hebrides have a long tradition of belief in the fair folk, and Eilean Mòr was known locally as a place to avoid, a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Fishermen from Lewis would not land on the island if they could help it. They crossed themselves when they passed it. They told their children stories about the lights that danced on the cliffs at night before the lighthouse was built, lights that did not come from any fire or any lamp. The men who built the lighthouse in 1897 and 1898 reported strange experiences. Tools that went missing, supplies that disappeared, the unsettling sensation of being unwelcome. Some of the construction workers refused to spend the night on the island. They rowed back to their ship in the evenings and slept on board, preferring the cramped discomfort of the vessel to the strange silence of the rock. These stories prove nothing, of course. Islands breed superstition. Isolation breeds fear. The human mind, left alone too long in a hostile environment, begins to see patterns that are not there, to hear voices that are not speaking, to feel presences that do not exist. Every isolated lighthouse in the world has its ghost stories. The keepers told them to pass the time. They embellished them with each retelling. They frightened the new men with tales of the keepers who came before, and the new men went home and frightened their families, and the stories spread outward like ripples in a pond until no one could remember anymore which parts were true and which parts were invented. But there is something different about the Flannan Isles, something that sets them apart from the other haunted lighthouses, the other unexplained maritime disappearances, the other mysteries of the Scottish coast. Perhaps it is the completeness of the vanishing. No bodies, no wreckage, no trace of any kind. Perhaps it is the logbook with its impossible weather and its frightened prayers. Perhaps it is the meal on the table, the overturned chair, the sense of interruption frozen in time like a photograph of the moment before catastrophe. Or perhaps it's something harder to name, something I felt myself when I stood in that empty lantern room and looked out at the grey Atlantic. A presence in the absence, a weight in the air, the feeling that the island was watching me, the way it had watched the keepers, the way it had watched the relief crew when they arrived on Boxing Day to find their colleagues gone. I left the Flannans that afternoon with more questions than I had arrived with. The crossing back to Lewis was calmer than the crossing out, and I stood on the deck of the boat and watched the island recede into the haze until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon, and then nothing at all. The lighthouse was still visible for some time after the island itself had vanished, a white needle against the grey sky, impossibly thin, impossibly bright, turning its beam in a slow circle even though no one was there to tend it. The light still turns today. You can see it from Lewis on clear nights, sweeping the darkness every 30 seconds, signalling to ships that the rocks are near and the water is dangerous. It is automated now, solar-powered, requiring no human intervention. The keepers are gone, all of them. Not just the 3 who vanished in 1900, but all the others who came after. The men who climbed those 71 steps and polished the lens and filled the oil reservoir and wrote their weather observations in the same logbook where Thomas Marshall once recorded impossible storms. The tradition is finished, the lights have won, and yet the mystery remains. It will always remain. There is no solving it now, no new evidence that will surface after a century and a quarter, no deathbed confession, no message in a bottle washing up on some distant shore. The 3 keepers of Eilean Mòr, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, Donald MacArthur, are gone as completely as if they had never existed, swallowed by the sea or taken by whatever else took them, their fate as unknown today as it was on December 26, 1900, when Joseph Moore climbed those steps and pushed open that unlocked door. What we are left with is not answers. What we are left with is the question itself, passed down from generation to generation like an heirloom that no one knows how to display. We tell the story, we speculate, we imagine what might have happened in our own minds, filling in the blanks with our own fears and our own fascinations. And somewhere out there in the Atlantic, on a rock that rises grey from the grey water, the light still turns. It has turned through 2 world wars, through the rise and fall of empires, through the transformation of the world from steam to electricity to silicon. It will turn long after we are gone, after everyone who remembers the keepers is gone, after the story itself has faded from memory and become nothing but a footnote in some archive that no one reads anymore. The Flannan Isles do not care about our questions. The sea does not care about our grief. They were here before us and they will be here after us, indifferent to everything except the slow cycles of tide and weather, the endless rising and falling of the Atlantic swell. But we are not indifferent. That is what separates us from the rock and the water. We remember. We ask questions. We stand in empty rooms and feel the presence of those who came before, and we wonder what happened to them, and we refuse to let them be forgotten, even when forgetting would be easier, even when forgetting would let us sleep at night without thinking about 3 men on a cliff in December, 3 men whose last moments we will never witness, whose last words we will never hear. There is a poem about the Flannan Isles, written just 2 years after the disappearance by a man named Wilfred Wilson Gibson. Gibson never visited the islands. He based his poem entirely on newspaper reports and his own imagination, but he understood something essential about the mystery, something that the official reports and the board inquiries and the witness statements all fail to capture. He understood that the power of the story lies not in the explanation, but in the absence of explanation. Not in what we know, but in what we cannot know, what we will never know, what the sea has chosen to keep for itself. The poem opens with 3 men arriving at the lighthouse to find what Joseph Moore found, but Gibson turns the moment into something more than mere discovery. He makes it a haunting. We seem to stand for an endless while, though still no word was said. The men in the poem are paralysed not by what they see, but by what they do not see, by the absence that fills every corner of the room more completely than any presence ever could. The table is set, the clock has stopped, the fire is dead, and the 3 keepers who should be there, who should be rising from their chairs to greet the relief, who should be complaining about the weather or asking for news from the mainland, and they are simply gone. Gibson understood that the real horror is not the storm or the wave or the violent end. The real horror is the silence that comes after. The poem does not attempt to explain. It does not speculate about rogue waves or madness or murder. It simply describes the silence, the wrongness, the way the empty room feels like a held breath that will never be released. And it ends not with answers, but with the image that every telling of this story must return to eventually. The sea itself, patient and impenetrable, keeping its secrets as it has always kept them, as it always will. Gibson was not a sailor. He was not a lighthouse keeper. He was a poet from the English Midlands who had never stood on the deck of a relief tender, watching the Flannan Isles grow larger in the haze. But he grasped something that many of the men who actually worked the lights struggled to articulate. He grasped that the lighthouses themselves were places out of time, places where the ordinary rules of the world did not quite apply, where men lived in a kind of suspension between the human world they had left behind and the elemental world that surrounded them on every side. The keepers on Eilean Mòr were not just doing a job, they were living a kind of exile, a voluntary banishment to a rock in the Atlantic where the only company was each other, and the only entertainment was the weather, and the only purpose was keeping that flame alive, keeping that lens turning, keeping the light burning no matter what. This is the context that the official reports so carefully avoid. They speak of duties and regulations and proper procedures. They note that Ducat was an experienced keeper, that Marshall was a capable assistant, that MacArthur was new but had been performing adequately. They record the weather observations and the lamp records and the inventory of supplies, but they do not speak about what it meant to live in that place, to wake every morning to the sound of wind and waves, to climb those 71 steps in the dark knowing that the ships out in the shipping lane depended on you, that the smallest lapse in attention could mean death for men you would never see, whose faces you would never know. They do not speak about the loneliness or the monotony, or the way time itself seemed to stretch and compress in unpredictable ways, days bleeding into nights, weeks into months, the rhythm of the watch becoming the only structure that gave meaning to existence. And they do not speak about the fear, the constant low-level fear that lived beneath the surface of every moment, the knowledge that the sea was always there, always waiting, always capable of rising up at any moment and taking everything. Donald MacArthur had been on the Flannan Isles for less than a month when he disappeared. He had arrived in the late November, taking the place of a keeper who had rotated back to the mainland for his rest period. We know almost nothing about what those weeks were like for him, how he adjusted to the isolation and the routine, whether he got along with Ducat and Marshall, whether he found the work fulfilling or merely endured it. The logbook entries from that period are sparse and businesslike, recording weather conditions and maintenance activities, but nothing of the human texture of daily life. MacArthur appears in them only as a name, an occasional notation that he had performed some task or stood some watch. He was the occasional keeper, the lowest in the hierarchy, the newest arrival. Whatever he was feeling, whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself or shared it only with the other 2 men, and they are not here to tell us. But we can imagine something of what it must have been like for a man experiencing his first winter on a rock 12 miles from the nearest shore. The weather in December would have been brutal, even by Hebridean standards. The daylight hours would have shrunk to barely 7 or 8 hours of grey watery light, with darkness pressing in on all sides for the remainder. The landings would have become increasingly difficult as the swells rose and the wind picked up, meaning that the supply ship might not come, that the relief might be delayed, that the 3 keepers might have to stretch their provisions and their patience further than they had planned. For a new man, still learning the rhythms of the station, still finding his place in the small society of the Lighthouse, this would have been an education in what the job truly demanded. We know from the later testimony of other keepers that the winter months on the Flannan Isles could be psychologically gruelling. The weather made outdoor work dangerous and often impossible, confining the men to the lighthouse itself for days at a stretch. The rooms were small. The company was limited to 2 other faces, 2 other voices, 2 other sets of habits and irritations. Minor disagreements could fester into real conflict. Old resentments could resurface, and always in the background was the sound of the wind and the waves, the constant reminder that they were living on the edge of an abyss, held in place by nothing more than stone and mortar and the stubborn determination of men who had chosen this life for reasons they might not even have been able to articulate. Thomas Marshall, the principal keeper, would have been responsible for maintaining discipline and morale in this environment. The logbook entries that Captain Harvey later found, the ones describing storms of impossible intensity, suggest that Marshall was struggling to make sense of something in those final days. He was a man who prided himself on accuracy, on careful observation, on doing his job properly. But something was happening on that rock that did not fit the categories his training had given him. Something was pushing at the edges of his understanding, demanding to be recorded even though the words he chose seemed inadequate to capture it. The debate about those logbook entries has never been fully resolved. Some researchers believe they are evidence of genuine meteorological anomalies, microbursts or localized storm cells that could have produced the effects Marshall described even while the surrounding waters remained relatively calm. Others think Marshall was confused, perhaps affected by illness or stress, perhaps misremembering observations from earlier storms and projecting them onto days when nothing unusual occurred. Still others have suggested that the entries themselves were fabricated or altered after the fact, though there is no evidence to support this and no clear motive for such a deception. What seems certain is that something was weighing on Marshall's mind in those final days. The tone of his entries shifts. The careful, professional observations give way to something more personal, more urgent. He writes about the waves as if they are alive, as if they have intentions. He describes Ducat as being quiet. An odd thing to note about a man he'd been living with for weeks, unless that quietness was new, unless it represented a change that worried him. And he notes that MacArthur has been crying. A detail that startles the reader even now, a century and a quarter later, because it suggests depths of emotion and distress that the official reports so carefully smooth over. Why was MacArthur crying? We will never know. Perhaps the isolation was proving harder than he had expected. Perhaps he had received bad news from home before the communications with the mainland were cut off. Perhaps the storms that Marshall was describing, whether real or imagined, had frightened him in ways that a more experienced keeper would have been able to manage. Or perhaps there was something else happening on that rock, something that none of the 3 men understood, something that was building toward a catastrophe that would take them all. The speculation about those final days has taken many forms over the years. The most common theory, the one endorsed by Robert Muirhead and accepted by the Northern Lighthouse Board, is that 2 of the keepers went out to check on storm damage or secure equipment and were swept away by a rogue wave, and that the 3rd ran to help them and was taken as well. This theory explains the 2 missing oilskins, the unlocked door, the half-eaten meal. It explains why no bodies were ever recovered. It fits with the physical evidence, or at least does not directly contradict it. And it has the advantage of simplicity. 3 men, 1 wave, no mystery beyond the ordinary dangers of a dangerous place. But this theory has never fully satisfied those who have studied the case closely. For one thing, it requires us to believe that all 3 keepers abandoned their station at the same time, which was a direct violation of standing orders. The rules were explicit. At least 1 keeper must remain in the lighthouse at all times. The light must never be left unattended. This was not a suggestion or a guideline. It was the fundamental principle on which the entire lighthouse service was built. Men who abandoned the light, for any reason, could expect to lose their positions and their reputations. Ducat was a principal keeper with years of experience. Marshall was a conscientious man who took his responsibilities seriously. Even MacArthur, new as he was, would have understood that you do not leave the light. You do not leave the light for anything. So why did they leave? If a wave swept 2 of them away, why did the 3rd follow instead of staying at his post and reporting the disaster when the relief arrived? If they all went out together, what could have been so important, so urgent, that all 3 men would have violated their most sacred duty simultaneously? These questions have no good answers. Every attempt to explain the behaviour of the keepers runs into the same wall. These were not foolish men or reckless men. They knew the sea, they knew their jobs, they knew what was expected of them. And yet they did something that experienced keepers simply did not do. Some have suggested that the answer lies in the relationship between the 3 men themselves. Perhaps there was conflict, simmering tension that finally boiled over into something violent. Perhaps Duckett and MacArthur fought, and Marshall intervened, and the situation escalated in ways that no one intended. Or perhaps the dynamic was different. Perhaps Marshall and MacArthur turned against Duckett, the authority figure, the man who enforced the rules and assigned the duties. Or perhaps it was MacArthur, the newcomer, the outsider, who became the target of the other 2 men's frustrations. The cramped quarters, the endless weather, the isolation from everything familiar. These conditions have driven men to violence before. They have driven men to madness. But if violence occurred, where is the evidence? Joseph Mòr found no blood, no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture beyond the single chair. The kitchen was orderly except for the abandoned meal. The beds were made, the lamps were clean. If 3 men had fought, if one had killed the others, or if 2 had killed one, there should have been some trace, some mark, some indication that something terrible had happened. Instead, Mòr found only absence, only silence, only the wrongness of a place that looked exactly as it should, except for the fact that the people who belonged there were gone. This brings us to the theories that venture beyond the rational, beyond the explainable, into territory that the official reports refuse to acknowledge. Throughout the Outer Hebrides, the vanishing at Eilean Mòr was understood not as a maritime accident, but as something else entirely. The old people on Lewis, the ones who still remembered the stories their grandparents had told them, knew that the Flannan Isles had always been places of power and danger. The monks who had built the chapel on Eilean Mòr, the chapel that gave the islands their other name, the 7 Hunters, had chosen that location for a reason. The currents around those rocks did not behave like ordinary currents. The weather did not follow ordinary patterns. The birds that nested there in the thousands fell silent at times when birds should not fall silent. And then there was the matter of the little people. In Gaelic tradition, the good neighbours, the Sithician, were not the diminutive, whimsical creatures of Victorian fairy tales. They were powerful beings who existed alongside the human world but were not part of it, who followed their own laws and their own purposes, who could help or harm mortals as they chose. They were not to be spoken of directly, not to be named, not to be challenged or dismissed. Fishermen who passed the Flannan Isles would pour a libation into the water. Keepers who served on Eilean Mòr would follow certain protocols, never referring to the island by its true name when on the water, never whistling after dark, never disturbing certain stones or certain places. These were not superstitions in the way the mainlanders understood the term. They were survival strategies, accumulated wisdom about how to live alongside forces that did not care about human convenience or human plans. Robert Muirhead knew about these beliefs, Joseph Mòr knew about them. The keepers who served on the Flannan Isles before and after the disappearance knew about them. But none of this appeared in the official reports. None of it was mentioned in the Board of Inquiry. None of it found its way into the newspaper accounts that spread the story across the English-speaking world. The Northern Lighthouse Board was a modern institution dedicated to science and efficiency and the conquest of nature through technology. It had no room in its records for old stories and older fears. Whatever the men of Lewis believed in their hearts, whatever they whispered to each other when the officials were not listening, it was not the kind of evidence that could be submitted to a board of inquiry. But if you walk the islands today, if you make the difficult crossing and climb the cliff and stand among the ruins of the old chapel and the more recent structures of the lighthouse compound, you can feel something of what those keepers must have felt. The silence is not ordinary silence. The wind is not ordinary wind. The rock beneath your feet has a quality that is hard to describe. a sense of age and permanence and indifference that goes beyond anything the human mind can easily comprehend. You are standing on a place that existed for millions of years before the first human being was born, and that will exist for millions of years after the last human being is dead. The lighthouse is a temporary intrusion, a brief flickering of human presence in a vastness that takes no notice of it. The keepers were temporary intrusions as well. They came, they served, they left, or they vanished. The rock remained, and this perhaps is the deepest meaning of the Flannan Isles mystery. Not the specific question of what happened to Thomas Marshall and James Ducate and Donald MacArthur, but the larger question that their disappearance forces us to confront. We build our lighthouses and our ships and our civilizations, and we tell ourselves that we have mastered the sea, that we have pushed back the darkness, that we have made the world safe and comprehensible. But the sea is not mastered, the darkness is not pushed back, the world is not safe or comprehensible. The Flannan Isles stand as a reminder that there are places where human rules do not apply, where human understanding fails, where the careful structures we have built can be swept away in an instant by forces we do not even have names for. The keepers knew this. They knew it in their bones, in the weariness of their muscles after climbing those 71 steps for the 1,000th time, in the ache of their eyes after staring into the fog, in the cold that seeped through their oilskins no matter how carefully they dressed. They knew that they were living on the edge of something immense and unknowable, and that the light they tended was not a victory over the darkness, but merely a negotiation with it, a temporary truce that could be revoked at any moment. They kept the light burning anyway. They climbed the steps and polished the lens and recorded their observations and endured the loneliness and the fear, because that was their job, because they had given their word, because someone had to do it if the ships were to make it home. And then, one December, 3 of them were taken. Not by any enemy we can name or understand, not by any force we can see or measure, simply taken, removed from the world of the living and translated into the world of the unknown, where they remain to this day, where they will remain forever. The logbook ends on December 15th, 1900. After that date, there are no more entries. The page is blank, and the pages after it are blank, and no one will ever fill them in. The storm that Marshall described, whether real or imagined, whether natural or something else entirely, has passed beyond all verification. The oilskins that were missing have never been found. The bodies that should have washed up somewhere, if the wave theory is correct, never appeared on any shore. The sea kept what it took. It always does. But perhaps kept is not quite the right word. Perhaps the sea did not keep the 3 keepers so much as release them, let them go into whatever comes after the life we know, whatever waits beyond the edge of the map where the old cartographers wrote, "Here be dragons." Perhaps Marshall and Ducate and MacArthur are not lost at all but found by something larger than the world they left behind, something that does not care about lighthouse regulations or relief schedules or the anxious waiting of families on the mainland. Perhaps they walked into the storm willingly, called by a voice we cannot hear, answering a summons we cannot understand. Or perhaps none of this is true. Perhaps they simply slipped on wet rocks and fell into the churning water and drowned in seconds, their bodies pulled down by the weight of their clothes and the force of the currents, their lungs filling with salt water before they could even cry out. Perhaps there is no mystery at all, just the ordinary tragedy of men who worked a dangerous job in a dangerous place and paid the price that such work sometimes demands. Perhaps we have made too much of an accident, turned 3 drownings into a ghost story because ghost stories are more interesting than accidents, because the unknown is more compelling than the merely unlucky. This is what the rational mind insists. This is what the Board of Inquiry concluded, more or less, though they hedged their language and left room for doubt. The most likely explanation is the simplest one. The sea took them. The sea does that sometimes. End of story. But the story does not end. It has not ended for 125 years, and it will not end for 125 more. Because the simple explanation, true as it may be, does not account for the feeling that Joseph Moore had when he climbed those steps and pushed open that door. It does not account for the wrongness, the silence, the sense of a presence recently departed, of a departure that was not quite departure, of 3 men who were there and then were not there, and whose not being there was somehow more palpable than any presence could ever be. And this is what we must sit with, you and I, as the candle burns low and the night presses against the windows. Not the explanation, but the inexplicable. Not the answer, but the question that refuses to close. Because Joseph Mòr did not simply find an empty lighthouse that December morning. He found an absence so profound it had weight, had texture, had a kind of terrible presence all its own. The clocks had stopped, or rather there were no clocks on Eilean Mòr, and yet something had stopped all the same, some invisible mechanism that governs the normal passage of time in a place where people live and work and breathe. The air itself felt wrong, Mòr would say later, though he struggled to explain what wrong air might mean, how a man might taste absence on his tongue like copper or fear. The flagstones under his feet seemed too solid, as if they were the only real thing remaining in a world that had become suddenly terrifyingly thin. He called out their names again, and once more. Marshall, Duckett, MacArthur. His voice swallowed by the stone walls, absorbed by the silence the way a sponge absorbs water, completely, leaving nothing behind. No echo, no answer. Just his own words falling dead at his feet like birds shot from the sky. And then he noticed the meal. It has become famous now, this detail, passed from telling to telling until it gleams with the dark patina of legend. A half-eaten meal on the table, a chair overturned on the floor, the scene of an interrupted life, frozen in the moment of interruption, waiting for someone to come back and finish what had been started. The newspapers would seize upon this image and never let it go. The chair that someone had pushed back so violently it fell, the food that had been abandoned mid-bite, the sudden urgency that had pulled all three men from their dinner and sent them out into the storm, or whatever it was that waited outside. But here is where we must be careful. Here is where the truth of that December afternoon begins to diverge from the story that would later be told about it, and the divergence matters terribly, because it is in the gap between what actually happened and what people wanted to believe that the mystery of Eilean Mòr truly resides. Let me tell you what Mòr actually saw, as best as we can reconstruct it from the official reports and the testimony he gave in the weeks that followed. The kitchen was tidy. The dishes had been washed, or most of them had been washed, and placed in their proper places. The provisions were in order. The beds were made. 2 of them, at least, which suggests that 2 of the men had risen that day and performed their morning duties while the 3rd had perhaps remained on watch, or worked elsewhere in the lighthouse. The lamp was trimmed and ready for the evening's lighting, though it would not be lit that evening or any evening until the relief crew arrived and took up the work the keepers had left behind. There was no overturned chair, or if there was, Mòr did not mention it in his initial report. There was no half-eaten meal sitting on the table, no food left mid-bite as if the eaters had been summoned away by some invisible trumpet. These details came later, added by journalists and storytellers who understood that a mystery needs furniture, needs props, needs the visible evidence of sudden catastrophe if it is to capture the imagination and hold it fast. The truth was more subtle and therefore more disturbing. The lighthouse was clean. The lighthouse was orderly. Everything was in its place except for the 3 men who should have been there and who were not, who had vanished so completely that not a single trace of them remained except for their absence, their terrible roaring absence that filled every corner of every room and pressed against the walls like a living thing trying to break free. This is what Mòr understood as he stood in that kitchen, breathing in the smell of lamp oil and stone and something else, something he could not name but which he would never forget as long as he lived. He understood that whatever had happened to the keepers had not been sudden. There had been no emergency that pulled them from their dinner, no alarm that sent them racing out into the storm with their meals left steaming on the table. They had finished their duties. They had set the lighthouse in order. They had prepared for the night's work, and then they had gone somewhere, gone somehow, gone completely and utterly and forever. 2 oilskins were missing from the hooks by the door. Only 2. The 3rd hung where it always hung, dry and waiting for a man who would never return to claim it. This detail Mòr noted carefully, and it troubled him deeply, because it suggested something almost unbearable to contemplate. If 2 men had taken their oilskins, then 2 men had gone outside, had prepared themselves for the weather, had known they were stepping into wind and rain, and the wild fury of the Atlantic winter. But the 3rd man, what of him? Had he gone out bareheaded into the storm? Had he followed the others without pausing to grab his coat, driven by urgency or fear or something else entirely? Or had he never gone out at all? Had something come in for him, something that did not care about oilskins or open doors, Something that could take a man from inside a locked lighthouse without leaving a single mark upon the walls? This was the question that haunted Mòr as he moved through the silent rooms, checking the mechanisms, inspecting the lamp, looking for anything that might explain the inexplicable. He found nothing. Or rather, he found everything exactly as it should be, except for the keepers themselves, who should have been there and were not, who had been swallowed by the silence as completely as a stone swallowed by the sea. The lamp. We should speak of the lamp for a moment, because the lamp was everything. The lamp was the entire reason for the lighthouse's existence, and the lamp had been dark for 11 days when Mòr arrived on that December afternoon. Imagine the ships that had passed Eilean Mòr in those 11 days. Imagine the captains who had looked for the light and found only darkness, who had adjusted their courses and said prayers under their breath, and wondered what could have happened to the beacon that was supposed to guide them safely through the treacherous waters of the Outer Hebrides. Some of them would have thought it was a malfunction, a mechanical failure, an extinguished flame that would surely be relit by morning. Others might have wondered if the keepers had fallen ill, all three of them struck down by some sudden sickness that left no one to climb the steps and strike the match. A few, the superstitious ones, the old salts who still believed in the stories their grandfathers told, might have felt a chill run down their spines, might have remembered the old names for the Flannan Isles, the names that spoke of monks and hermits and something older still, something that had lived on those rocks long before any human being set foot upon them. The 7 Hunters, the islands were called. But who were the hunters, and what were they hunting? The question had never seemed particularly important until now, until 3 men went missing and left no trace, until the lamp went dark and the silence settled over Eilean Mòr like a shroud. Mòr lit the lamp that night. He had to. That was his duty. That was what he'd been sent to do, and he did it even though his hands were trembling and his heart was pounding, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to get back on the boat and never set foot on this accursed rock again. He climbed the steps to the lamp room, the same steps that Marshall and Duckett and MacArthur had climbed 1,000 times before him, and he filled the reservoir and trimmed the wick and struck the match, and the light burst into life and swept its beam across the dark water, and for a moment, just a moment, everything was as it should be. The light was burning, the lamp was lit, the ships could find their way. But the keepers were still gone. The light could not bring them back. Nothing could bring them back. The relief crew stayed on the island for several days, waiting for the investigating officers to arrive, searching the rocks and cliffs for any sign of the missing men. They found nothing. No bodies tangled in the seaweed at the base of the cliffs. No scraps of clothing caught on the jagged stones. No boot prints preserved in some sheltered patch of earth that might show where the keepers had walked in their final moments. The island had been washed clean by the winter storms, scrubbed bare by the wind and the waves, and whatever evidence might once have existed had been carried away into the vast indifferent depths of the Atlantic. They did find damage. This much is documented, attested to by multiple witnesses, entered into the official record where it remains to this day. On the western landing, the more exposed of the 2 landings, the one that faced the full fury of the open sea, the iron railings had been twisted and torn as if by some tremendous force. A wooden storage box that had been secured to the cliff with ropes and iron fittings had been ripped from its moorings and smashed to pieces. The concrete path that led down to the landing platform showed cracks and stress fractures that had not been there before. Something had happened on the western side of the island, something powerful enough to bend iron and shatter wood and crack reinforced concrete. But here is the strange thing. The detail that does not fit any simple explanation. The fact that has troubled investigators for over a century and will trouble them for centuries more. The eastern landing was untouched. The eastern landing, which was on the same island, only a few hundred yards from the western landing, showed no signs of damage whatsoever. The railings were intact. The storage equipment was secure. The concrete was smooth and uncracked. Whatever storm or wave or force of nature had devastated the western side of Eilean Mòr had somehow failed to affect the eastern side at all. This is not how storms work. This is not how waves work. A storm powerful enough to twist iron railings would have battered the entire island, would have sent spray and debris flying in all directions, would have left marks on every exposed surface. A wave large enough to crack reinforced concrete would have been felt throughout the Outer Hebrides, would have been reported by the ships at sea and the villages on the coast, would have left its signature in damaged harbours and flooded low-lying areas for miles around. But no such storm was reported. No such wave was observed. The fishermen on Lewis and Harris had noted rough weather in December. Rough weather was normal in December, was expected in December, was simply part of life in the Outer Hebrides. But nothing unusual, nothing catastrophic, nothing that would explain the devastation on the western landing of Eilean Mòr. So what happened? The Board of Inquiry, faced with this contradiction, did what boards of inquiry have always done when faced with contradictions they cannot resolve. They chose the most rational explanation and ignored the details that did not fit. The keepers, they concluded, had gone to the western landing to secure equipment during a sudden squall. They had been caught by an unexpectedly large wave, swept from the rocks and drowned. The damage to the western landing was caused by this wave, or by the storm that accompanied it. The fact that no such storm was observed elsewhere was simply a gap in the record, a failure of documentation rather than a failure of explanation. It was a reasonable conclusion. It was in many ways the only conclusion that reasonable men could reach, given the evidence available and the limitations of human understanding. The sea is dangerous. Waves are unpredictable. Men who work in dangerous places sometimes pay with their lives. The board members had families to return to, duties to attend to, reports to file, and policies to implement. They could not afford to dwell on the things that did not make sense, the details that whispered of something stranger and darker than a simple maritime accident. But Thomas Marshall's logbook would not let them rest entirely. The entries from December 12th through the 15th, with their talk of storms that raged for days, of waves that battered the island without ceasing, of keepers who prayed and wept and clung to each other in the face of nature's fury. These entries could not be easily explained away. If Marshall was telling the truth, then his account contradicted everything the investigators knew about the weather during that period. The reports from the mainland showed rough but not exceptional conditions. The ships that had passed through the area had noted nothing unusual. The storm that Marshall described, 3 days of unrelenting fury, waves that made the cliffs tremble and the lighthouse shake, existed only in his logbook, as if it had been a private storm, a storm meant for the keepers alone, a storm that no one else could see or hear or feel. But if Marshall was lying, or if he was confused, or if his mind had begun to slip under the pressure of isolation and fear, then why? What purpose would it serve to invent a storm that had not happened, to fill page after page with descriptions of weather that existed only in his imagination? Marshall had been a keeper for years. He was experienced, reliable, trusted by his superiors and respected by his peers. Men like Marshall did not fabricate logbook entries. They did not invent emergencies that had not occurred. They wrote down what they observed, as they had been trained to do, because accurate records were essential to the operation of a lighthouse and the safety of the ships that depended upon it. Unless something had changed, unless something had happened to Thomas Marshall in those final days, something that had altered his perception, shifted his understanding, opened his eyes to things that normal people could not see. Unless the storm he described was real, was terribly, catastrophically real, but only for those who were there to witness it, only for those who had been marked for something that defied rational explanation. The investigators did not pursue this line of thinking. They could not pursue it, not officially, not in a report that would be filed with the Northern Lighthouse Board and reviewed by government officials and preserved in the public record. They stuck to the facts as they understood them, drew the conclusions that the facts seemed to support, and closed the case with a verdict of death by misadventure, accidental drowning caused by the hazards of the occupation. But they added a note to their report, a small detail that has been quoted and requoted in every account of the Eilean Mòr disappearance ever written. They stated that the evidence was insufficient to determine exactly what had happened to the 3 keepers. They acknowledged the contradictions and the mysteries. They admitted in their careful bureaucratic language that the case could never be fully solved, that the questions would never be fully answered, that the truth of December 1900 would remain forever hidden in the silence of the sea and the darkness of the rocks. And so it has, and so it will. The files have been sealed and opened and sealed again. The theories have multiplied like barnacles on a ship's hull. Researchers and investigators and writers and filmmakers have combed through every scrap of evidence, interviewed every descendant they could find, walked the paths and climbed the stairs and stood in the lamp room where the keepers once stood, trying to feel what they felt, trying to understand what they understood. Some have come away convinced that the answer is simple, that the keepers were swept away by a rogue wave, that the mystery is no mystery at all, but merely the fog of time obscuring an ordinary tragedy. Others have come away less certain, troubled by the details that do not fit, haunted by the silence that Mòr described, unable to shake the feeling that something happened on Eilean Mòr that cannot be explained by waves or weather or any force that science recognizes. And a few have come away changed. There are stories, whispered stories, unofficial stories, stories that do not appear in any report or record, of visitors to Eilean Mòr who have seen things that should not be there. Lights in the windows when the lighthouse is empty, figures on the paths when no one is on the island, voices carried on the wind, speaking words that almost but not quite make sense, calling out names that no living person recognizes. These stories are dismissed by serious researchers as fantasy, as the products of overactive imaginations fed by too many ghost stories and too much time spent in lonely places. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps the mind, confronted with so much silence and so much history and so much unanswered fear, begins to fill in the gaps with visions of its own making. But the keepers knew something about silence, about what it does to the mind over days and weeks and months. They knew how the isolation could creep into a man's thoughts, how the darkness could seep into his dreams, how the wind could begin to sound like voices if you listened to it long enough. They knew because they lived it, because they breathed it, because it was the air they moved through every day of their working lives. And three of them, three experienced, reliable, trusted men, walked into that silence one December day and never came out again. Where did they go? The question hangs in the air like the smell of lamp oil, like the taste of salt spray, like the memory of a sound that was almost but not quite a voice. Where did Thomas Marshall go, with his logbook full of storms that no one else could see? Where did James Ducat go, with his years of experience and his steady hand and his reputation as a man who never lost his head in a crisis? Where did Donald MacArthur go, the occasional keeper, the man who was only there because he was filling in for another, the man who might have been anywhere else on Earth that December if the schedules had fallen differently? The sea does not answer. The rocks do not answer. The lighthouse, still standing, still operational, still guiding ships through the darkness of the Outer Hebrides, does not answer. It only keeps the light burning, as it has kept the light burning for over a century now, as it will keep the light burning for as long as the lamp is tended and the stairs are climbed, and someone is willing to do the lonely, terrifying work of standing between the ships and the darkness. The keepers are gone. The keepers have always been gone. The keepers will always be gone. And the light burns on, and the wind howls on, and the sea churns on, indifferent to our questions, unconcerned with our fear, keeping its secrets as it has always kept them, as it always will. But secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? Not all at once, not neatly packaged with explanations and apologies, but in fragments, in glimpses, in the quiet hours when the mind is too tired to defend itself against wonder. The Northern Lighthouse Board never closed the case. There was no case to close, not officially, only a tragedy, only 3 names to be struck from the rolls, only a report to be filed and a pension to be arranged and a new rotation of keepers to be trained. The machinery of administration ground on, as it always does, as it must. Ships still needed guidance through the Hebrides. The lamp still needed oil. The lens still needed polishing. Whatever had happened to Ducat and Marshall and MacArthur, the work of keeping the light could not stop for grief or mystery or the unanswerable questions that lingered in the salt air. Joseph Mòr stayed on at Eilean Mòr. This is a fact that deserves consideration, a detail that speaks volumes about the kind of men who chose this life. He had found his colleagues gone, had walked through those empty rooms, had read those impossible entries in the logbook, had slept in the beds where vanished men had lain their heads, and he stayed. He climbed the same stairs they had climbed. He wound the same mechanism they had wound. He watched the same horizon they had watched, knowing that whatever had come for them might still be out there, might still be watching, might still be waiting. He stayed because the light had to burn. He stayed because that was the work, and the work was bigger than fear, bigger than grief, bigger than any one man's terror in the face of the inexplicable. The new keepers who joined him in the weeks that followed reported nothing unusual. The storms that Marshall had logged in December did not return, or if they did, they left no impression strong enough to merit record. The island settled back into its rhythms of isolation and duty, the lighthouse resuming its place as just another station in the chain of lights that rimmed the Scottish coast. The newspapers moved on to other tragedies, other mysteries, other sensations. By the spring of 1901, Eilean Mòr had faded from public consciousness, replaced by fresh horrors and fresh wonders, the endless churn of news consuming yesterday's impossibilities to make room for tomorrow's. But the island did not forget. The keepers who served there in the years that followed knew the story, had heard it whispered in the training halls and the relief boats and the lonely watches of the night. They knew they were treading ground where 3 men had vanished, and that knowledge coloured everything. The shadows that seemed too deep, the winds that seemed too insistent, the moments of quiet that seemed too absolute. Some keepers requested transfers after only a few rotations. Others served for years without incident, developing their own relationship with the island's peculiar silence, learning to make peace with the mystery, or simply to set it aside, to focus on the work and let the questions gather dust in the corners of their minds. The lighthouse itself continued to evolve. New technologies replaced old ones, electric lights replacing oil lamps, automated systems replacing human hands, remote monitoring replacing physical presence. By the late 20th century, the need for resident keepers had diminished, and the old ways of the lighthouse service were fading into memory. The last keepers left Eilean Mòr in 1971, when the light was finally automated and the island returned to something like the solitude it had known before the lighthouse was built. No more footsteps on the spiral stairs, no more voices in the kitchen, no more human presence to break the endless conversation between wind and wave and stone. But automation could not erase history. The buildings remained, weathered but standing, their walls still holding the shape of the rooms where Duckett and Marshall and MacArthur had lived their last days. The paths they had walked still wound across the island's surface, worn into the rock by generations of keepers making their rounds. The view from the tower was still the same view they had seen, the same endless water, the same wheeling birds, the same distant line where sea met sky in a blur of grey. And the questions remained, as persistent as the tides, wearing away at certainty the way the waves wore away at the cliffs. Researchers continued to visit, even after the keepers were gone. Historians and paranormal investigators and documentary filmmakers, each bringing their own theories, their own equipment, their own desperate hope that they might be the one to finally crack the code. They measured electromagnetic fields and recorded ambient sounds and analysed water samples and interviewed elderly islanders whose grandparents might have known someone who knew something. They produced books and articles and television programs, each one adding another layer to the legend, each one ending with the same unsatisfying admission: we do not know. We cannot know. The evidence is too thin, the witnesses are too long dead, the sea has swallowed whatever truth there was to find. And yet, there is one more thread to follow, one more path through this labyrinth of silence and shadow. It begins not on Eilean Mòr but on the mainland, in the archives where the Northern Lighthouse Board kept its records, in the files where Joseph Moore's original report was stored alongside the official findings of the investigation. For decades, these documents were rarely consulted. Dry administrative paperwork of interest only to historians of maritime law or the occasional researcher with a specific question about lighthouse operations. But in the 1970s, as the last keepers were leaving and the age of automation was beginning, someone thought to take a closer look at what had been preserved. What they found was troubling. The logbook, Marshall's logbook, with its impossible storms and its cryptic final entries, had been copied into the official record, but the original was gone, misplaced perhaps, or damaged, or simply lost in the shuffle of decades and the reorganisation of archives. The copy that remained was a transcription, handwritten by some unknown clerk, and it did not quite match the excerpts that Moore had quoted in his initial report. Small differences, the kind that might be attributed to human error or the difficulties of reading cramped handwriting in poor light. But small differences nonetheless. A word changed here, a date shifted there, a phrase that didn't quite capture the urgency that Moore had described when he first read the entries aloud to Captain Harvey. And then there was the question of the meals. Moore had reported finding the remains of a half-eaten meal in the kitchen. Cold porridge, a chair overturned, the table set as if the keepers had been interrupted in the middle of eating. This detail had become central to the legend, one of those vivid images that seemed to capture the suddenness of whatever had happened. 3 men sitting down to eat, then something, a sound, a sight, a premonition, pulling them from their chairs and out into the storm. But the official report, the one filed weeks later after the investigation had concluded, made no mention of a half-eaten meal. It described the kitchen as in good order, the provisions as properly stored, the interior as clean and undisturbed. A contradiction. A small one, perhaps, but a contradiction nonetheless. Had Mòr misremembered? Had the official investigators simply not noticed what he had noticed? Had someone cleaned the kitchen in the days between Mòr's arrival and the formal investigation? Or had the scene been altered somehow, tidied up, made to fit a narrative that was easier to explain and easier to file away? We cannot know. The men who wrote these reports are long dead. The original logbook is lost. The kitchen has been empty for half a century, and whatever traces of that final meal might once have remained have long since vanished into the salt air and the endless damp. But the contradiction lingers, a small crack in the foundation of certainty, a reminder that even the things we think we know about Eilean Mòr may not be quite what they seem, and the contradictions do not end there. Over the years, other researchers have found other discrepancies, dates that do not align, names that are slightly misspelled, weather records from nearby stations that do not match the conditions Marshall described. Some of these discrepancies can be explained by the chaos of the situation, the difficulty of communicating across islands and between organisations in an era before reliable radio contact. Some can be explained by human error, the inevitable mistakes that creep into any record when multiple people are copying and transcribing and summarising. But taken together, they create a picture that is less certain than the legend suggests, more fragmented, more open to interpretation. This is the fate of all old mysteries, perhaps. The further we get from the event, the more the details blur and shift, the more the story becomes a thing that we tell rather than a thing that happened. The Eilean Mòr vanishing has become a legend, and legends have their own logic, their own requirements. They need to be dramatic, need to be memorable, need to have clear images that the mind can grasp. The overturned chair, the half-eaten meal, the clock stopped at a particular hour. Whether or not these images correspond to what actually happened is almost beside the point. They are what we remember, what we repeat, what we pass on to the next generation of storytellers. But beneath the legend, beneath the dramatic images and the whispered theories, there is still the fact. 3 men did vanish. Their bodies were never found. The island where they lived out their final days still stands, still feels the weight of their absence, still holds whatever truth there is to hold. And the light still burns, automated now, indifferent to the story that swirls around its base, doing the work it was built to do, without the need for human hands or human courage or human sacrifice. Let me take you back one more time, one more. Let me take you to December 1900, to a night we can only imagine because no one was there to record it. Let the wind rise around you, let the spray hit your face, cold and sharp as broken glass. Let the darkness press in from all sides, held back only by that single flame in the tower, that tiny point of warmth and light in a universe of cold and shadow. You are Thomas Marshall. You are standing at the western edge of the island, where the cliffs drop away into nothingness, where the waves crash against the rocks with a force that you can feel in your chest. The wind is screaming, not the steady blow of a normal Hebridean gale, but something else, something that sounds almost like voices, almost like words. You've been on this island for weeks now, and the isolation has begun to wear on you in ways you did not expect. The logbook entries you have been writing seem strange even to you. Descriptions of storms that your colleagues say they cannot see, accounts of disturbances that leave no mark on the land but leave you shaking and pale. Ducat is somewhere behind you, MacArthur too. You can feel their presence even if you cannot see them, the other 2 points of the triangle that has defined your life for these long weeks. They are good men, reliable men, men you would trust with your life. But there is something wrong tonight, something you cannot name, something that makes you want to run even though there is nowhere to run to, makes you want to scream even though your voice would be lost in the wind, and then you see it, or hear it, or feel it. The distinction becomes meaningless in this moment, in this place, where the boundary between the senses has begun to blur. Something is coming. Something has always been coming. Something has been waiting in the darkness of the Outer Hebrides since before there were lighthouses, since before there were men, since before there was anything on these rocks but the waves and the wind and the endless hunger of the deep. What do you do? This is the question that has haunted everyone who has ever studied this case, everyone who has ever stood on Eilean Mòr and felt the weight of its silence pressing down on them. What would make 3 experienced keepers abandon their post, leave behind their coats and their life jackets and their training, walk out into a December storm to face whatever was waiting for them? Not a rogue wave. They would have seen it coming, would have had time to brace themselves, would have known better than to stand exposed on the cliff's edge. Not an accident, not all 3 of them, not at the same time, not without a single trace left behind. Not madness, not all 3 of them, not experienced men who had passed their psychological evaluations, not men who had family and futures and every reason to survive. Something else. Something that defies the categories we have built to understand the world. Something that belongs to the old stories, the stories that were ancient when the lighthouse was built, the stories of sea spirits and water horses and the voices that call from the waves on moonless nights, stories that rational men dismissed as superstition, as the fevered imaginings of an ignorant age, stories that the keepers themselves might have laughed at in the warm safety of the kitchen, with the lamp burning bright and their colleagues beside them. But on a night like that December night, alone on the edge of the world with the wind howling words that were almost but not quite understandable, on a night like that, how rational would any of us be? The sea does not answer. It has never answered. It is not in the sea's nature to answer questions, to provide comfort, to offer the closure that the human heart craves. The sea simply is, vast and cold and ancient, full of life and full of death, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. It was here before we were, and it will be here after we're gone, and in the meantime it will keep taking its tribute of ships and sailors and lighthouse keepers, 1 by 1 or 3 by 3, whenever the mood strikes it, whenever the stars align, whenever the moment is right. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, Donald MacArthur. These are names now, just names, letters arranged in a particular order and attached to faces we can barely imagine. They were more than names once. They were men. Men with hands that grew calloused from winding the mechanism, men with eyes that grew tired from watching the horizon, men with hearts that ached for their families on the mainland, men with dreams that extended beyond the walls of a lighthouse to futures they would never see. They were men who did their duty, who kept the light burning through storms and silence and the long dark months of the Hebridean winter. They were men who earned their rest, their memory, their place in whatever peace the dead are granted. We failed them in a way. We failed to find their bodies, to bring them home, to give them the burial they deserved. We failed to solve the mystery of their disappearance, to provide their families with answers, to honour their sacrifice with understanding. We have only questions, only theories, only the endless churning of speculation that has worn this story smooth over more than a century of telling and retelling. But perhaps that failure is also a kind of gift. Perhaps the mystery itself is a form of immortality, a way of keeping these 3 men alive in the only way that matters, in the minds of the living, in the stories we tell on dark nights, in the questions that pull us back again and again to a small island in the Outer Hebrides, where the light still burns and the wind still howls and the sea still keeps its secrets. The next time you see a lighthouse, any lighthouse anywhere in the world, think of them. Think of the men who lived in those towers, who climbed those stairs, who tended those flames through cold and loneliness and fear. Think of what they gave up so that ships could find their way home, so that sailors could see the rocks before it was too late, so that the darkness would not swallow everything. Think of the duty they carried, the isolation they endured, the quiet heroism of their ordinary days. And think of Eilean Mòr. Think of 3 men who walked out into a December storm and never came back. Think of the chair that was overturned, or the kitchen that was tidy depending on which account you believe. Think of the logbook with its impossible storms, the clock that may or may not have stopped, the gate that was closed or open, the oilskins that were missing or present. Think of Joseph Moore climbing the stairs alone, calling out names that no one would answer. Think of the relief boat waiting in the harbour, the captain peering through his telescope, seeing the flag that should have been raised lying still and untouched. Think of the years that followed, the keepers who came and went, the automation that eventually replaced them, the island returning to its ancient silence. empty now except for the seabirds and the wind and the light that still turns, steady and patient, marking the passage of time in revolutions that no one counts anymore. The mystery remains. The mystery will always remain. Some questions have no answers, and some stories have no endings, and some losses can never be recovered or explained or made sense of. But we remember. That is what we do. We strange and fragile creatures who have learned to make fire and build towers and push back against the darkness even when the darkness seems infinite and we seem so small. We remember the ones who came before us. We speak their names into the silence. We refuse to let them be forgotten, even when we cannot understand what happened to them, even when the understanding we crave is forever beyond our reach. Thomas Marshall, James Duquette. Donald MacArthur, I have spoken your names, I have told your story, I have carried your memory across the years and the miles and the deep waters that separate us. I do not know what happened to you on that December day in 1900. I do not know where you went or why you left or what you saw in those final moments. But I know that you were real, that you lived, that you did work that mattered, that you deserved better than the silence that swallowed you. The light burns on, the wind howls on, the sea churns on, indifferent to our questions, unconcerned with our grief, keeping its secrets as it has always kept them, as it always will. But we remember. We remember. And somewhere in the Outer Hebrides, on a small island that most people will never visit, 3 keepers stand forever on the edge of the cliffs, looking out at something we cannot see, walking towards something we cannot name, vanishing into the storm that has never stopped blowing, not for a single moment, in all the years since they were lost. If you have a lighthouse story, or a vanishing, or a mystery from the old seaways that you think deserves to be remembered, I want to hear it. Leave it below or carry it with you, or whisper it to the wind the next time you stand near the water. The sea may not answer, but someone is always listening.